Welcome back to our channel, where the evil spirits gather. If this is your first time visiting, hello, I am David, the owner of this place. Now please come into my house. I will take you to meet the spirits. How will today's story unfold? Please listen to it right away. Since ancient times, the central region has suffered from many natural disasters and floods every year, especially in the 1945s, when famine raged everywhere. The poor people not only had to starve to death like straw, but also had to endure floods that swept away everything, making life even more miserable. Tony was only 17 years old at that time, a beautiful, gentle girl known in the area. She was born into a poor family in a small village in the central region. After just one night of floods, she lost her father forever, and then a series of tragedies happened to her family and the fate of the young girl. One rainy and flooded night, Tony was begging his father, Mr. Troy, to climb up to the roof to avoid being swept away by the flood, because this poor village was now submerged in water. Mr. Troy was trying to hold on to a thatched wall, despite the raging flood. He raised his voice, telling his mother and son to stay up there. He alone could hold on below. No matter how much his wife Lara tried to persuade him, he refused to go up, because he knew that if he had to support one more person, the roof would collapse immediately, and then the whole family would just have to hug each other and drown. Ironically, a flood from upstream suddenly poured down. Wave after wave rose. The water swirled more rapidly. Each thatched roof swayed. Screams for help, the screams of those who lost their loved ones, echoed. Mr. Troy tried to hold on to the wall of the house. The wave rushed in quickly, accompanied by large tree branches falling down. Just like that, the wave swept him away, accompanied by the cries for help from Tony and his mother. Witnessing that scene, they could only hug each other and scream. In the middle of such a big flood, no one would have the courage to jump in to save people. At the same time, at the village school, a fat man with a big belly was sitting in front, puffing on opium, then leaning back and exhaling smoke, his eyes half closed in pleasure. He was old Steve, the most evil and sinister person in the village, from seizing land to oppressing the innocent people to work for free and raising taxes 2 or 3 times higher than the amount set by the authorities. Old Steve's house was located on a high ground away from the upstream flow, so no matter how much rain or flood it would only reach the outer gate and could not enter the house. On the right was Mrs. Vera, old Steve's first wife, who was sitting and chanting sutras. Her appearance was always pious and religious, but her heart was evil and cruel, even when paying taxes and rice. People were only short of 1 kilo of rice, but she confiscated all the rice and falsely accused them of cheating. She had no choice but to confiscate all the shoes, as if people had not paid the tax this season, oppressing and forcing the villagers to pay both taxes next season. This way, the rich got richer, while the poor never had enough to eat. The slave's voice informed him that the whole village was in danger because of the rising floodwaters, and asked if old Steve would send someone to bring a boat to help. With that contemptuous attitude and inhumane lifestyle, there was no way he would help anyone. Not only that, he also cursed the slave for being an idiot who dared to disturb his sleep. After saying that, old Steve took a few more puffs of his cigarette, leaned back and tapped his feet, his eyes half closed, and fell into the high that the opium brought, and he said softly, "The more rains come, the more people will die. The land and wealth here will belong to me." A day and a night passed. The rain stopped. Jean, the floodwater, also slowly receded. The poor village now had only ruins left, the corpses of pigs, dogs, and even dead people lying all over the land. Every 2 or 3 steps, a dead body would be seen lying on the ground. Tony looked around and burst into tears, calling his father's name in vain. The mother and son had now climbed down to the ground, asking everywhere if anyone had seen Mr. Troy, but the response was cold shakes of the head from everyone. With no other choice, the mother and son tried to drag their heavy steps, turning over each corpse to look for Mr. Troy. After a while, Both of them decided to go to a large tree nearby to sit and rest. Mrs. Lara's eyes looked far away, absent-minded, thinking back to the time before, when the family of three was still together and warm. Tony was silent. Suddenly he felt something dripping on his head. Thinking it was rain, he reflexively reached out to block it. When he looked back to see, he was startled to see a red color of blood. She screamed in horror, making Mrs. Lara startled too. Both of them looked up at the high tree branch. There was a corpse stuck on it. Blood was dripping from the mouth of the corpse. When Mrs. Lara regained her composure, when she looked closely at the corpse's face, she screamed again when she realized it was Mr. Troy's corpse. Unable to bear the great shock, Mrs. Lara fainted. Tony was at a loss for words. He could only run away and call for help. 2 or 3 men ran to help bring Mr. Troy's corpse down. The corpse, stuck on the tree, was brought down to the ground, but his body was no longer intact. Mr. Troy's stomach was punctured by the branches, with pieces of intestines sticking out. Tony hugged his father's body and cried bitterly. The crowd gathered around. Everyone witnessed a 17-year-old girl having to endure this tragedy. Everyone felt sorry for Tony. They came over to comfort him a few words, and then dispersed to take care of their loved ones who were about to die. Tony just sobbed while holding his father's body. 2 hours had passed. Mrs. Lara had just woken up, and when she saw her husband's dead body in front of her eyes, she cried until she fainted again. Tony had to ask the men in the village to dig a hole for him to bury his poor father. The hole was quickly dug, located far away. Mr. Troy's body was put in the hole. Tony scooped up handfuls of sand to cover it. Mrs. Lara was sent to a nearby residence house to rest, while Tony buried his father alone somewhere and then returned to take care of his mother. Mrs. Lara was like a lifeless corpse. Her health was completely weakened. At night, because Tony missed his father so much, he went to Mr. Troy's grave to watch over it. His heart was in turmoil under the flickering fire. Tony sat with his head bowed beside the grave, his heart filled with indescribable sadness. She evoked so many memories, and also the ambitions and dreams in her heart, now like those branches, burning brightly and then immediately dying out. It was already late at night. Tony sat with his head resting on the grave and fell asleep without knowing it. Suddenly, she felt like someone's hand was touching her body, from her feet up to her body, and caressing her cheek. She woke up with a start. Before her eyes was the shadow of a man. Tony stepped back when he realized it was the eldest son of the village chief, Steve. He had always been famous for his depraved lust, gluttony, and laziness. Tony's fear was clearly visible on his face, making him even more excited. Tony now used all his strength to push her away and screamed miserably, begging when he saw that the guy had the intention of depraving her. His hands and feet clawed. Tony tried to reach a nearby tree branch and hit the guy's head several times. Obviously, this action made the guy extremely angry. He immediately gave her several strong slaps. Tony was in so much pain that he couldn't cry out. He could only lie there and suffer. It wasn't until Tony passed out that the guy finally let go. He lay on the ground and laughed contentedly, licked his lips and hiccuped, then rolled over and snored. The guy had raped her right on her father's grave when the soil hadn't even dried yet. Early in the morning, Gene, a 12-year-old boy living in the village, was walking through each grave looking for his father's grave to burn incense. While looking around, Gene was frightened and screamed as if he saw something terrifying. The people who were cleaning nearby were startled when they heard Gene scream and stood up to see what was happening. Gene was running and screaming loudly when he met the people who were cleaning. He stopped and breathed heavily. His face was flustered as he spoke and pointed towards the old tree in the wasteland. Everyone rushed over. Before their eyes was a horrifying scene that haunted everyone who saw it. Some people couldn't bear it and screamed. On the old tree was the body of a girl hanging by a noose. Her legs were about 1 meter above the ground. Her hair was disheveled and long, covering most of her face. Her tongue was sticking out almost to her neck. Her eyes were rolled back and white. Her skin was purple and black from suffocation. The body was hanging on the tree, and no one dared to climb up and take it down. It was truly a childless grave. The wind blowing through made everyone present shiver. That body belonged to none other than Tony. Perhaps because of too much anger and humiliation, she had hanged herself. After hearing the news, old Steve and his servants went down to the old tree. The villagers feared him because he was too cruel and inhumane. The servants loudly shouted at the people around to get out of the way. Chief Steve leaned on his bamboo stick and walked in step by step, looked at the hanging corpse, spat on the ground, cursed under his breath, and ordered the corpse to be taken down. Mrs. Lara saw her daughter's cold corpse, and her heart ached. She screamed and crawled to the ground, screaming and shouting. She turned back to cling to old Steve's legs and begged him to investigate. She didn't believe that her daughter would suddenly choose such a tragic death. Someone must have killed her. Unexpectedly, he threw her away and conveniently hit her back with his stick a few times to show off to the whole world. Although the people present were very indignant and pitiful for Mrs. Lara, absolutely no one dared to say a word. Tony's body was still hanging. No one dared to climb up to take it down, because just standing below and looking was enough to make people shiver. Only when they heard Steve's shouts, the young men, afraid of being beaten, had to grit their teeth and climb up the tree to take the body down. Only then did everyone gather closer. Only Mrs. Lara, when she saw her son's body falling from above, could not bear it and screamed in horror, hurriedly crawling closer to her son's body. Tony's eyes were still wide open. Someone tried to use their hands to close Tony's eyes, but those white eyes were still the same. Mrs. Lara cried and hugged her son's body, thinking that the sacred motherly love would help Tony close his eyes. But no, those eyes were still wide open as before, as if Tony had died a miserable death with overwhelming resentment. The noose was still on the tree, hanging there, as if waiting for the next person. His body was brought home by everyone. The house was destroyed by the flood, so Tony's body was only wrapped in a torn mat. Mrs. Lara fainted again and again. The pain of losing her husband and child was too much for an old woman like her to bear. Even more bitter was that her 12-year-old daughter died with her eyes open. Hours passed. Her eyes were still wide open. No matter how she stroked them, they wouldn't close. It took a long time to calm down. Mrs. Lara ran everywhere to ask people to carry her daughter's body near Troy's grave on the island, a nearby grave, so that father and son could lie close to each other. It seemed that the tragedy would stop there, but once again, God trampled on the spirit and body of the poor woman who had just lost both her husband and child. Above the high grave, where the grave had been dug, a group of people were digging hard. These were old Steve's family. They were trying to dig up Troy's grave. Steve the chief was so mean that he even fought over the land of the dead just to follow the feng shui master's words that this was good land, seeing the dry, high land connected to the old man's fortune only when digging up Mr. Troy's grave, combined with the man's magic, could old Steve's family prosper. Hearing the screams from behind, old Steve now held his stick and pointed at Mrs. Lara and shouted, "Dog relying on being close to home." The eldest man also fought against the cold and cursed. "The group of people in front of us are dirty black people," he said, then quickly walked over, grabbed the mat with his hand and pulled it out, throwing it straight out. After a while, he went to the corpse and kicked it hard, making it turn over. He had no idea that it was the victim he had raped last night. Only when he got closer did he scream in horror, fall backwards and stammer in his throat. He realized that the corpse lying there was Tony. His lifeless white eyes were staring up at him. His tongue was sticking out. His limbs were shaking uncontrollably. He reached behind him to find something to hold on to. When Mrs. Lara saw her son's body being tortured, She rushed forward to hug him. She screamed miserably and pointed at her eldest son and cursed him as a wolf-hearted son of a bitch. The eldest son was now helped up by the servants. His body was shaking like a leaf. His face was drained of blood. Old Steve saw his son's unusual fear and let it go. He put his stick on the ground and loudly declared that the land where Troy was buried was the land that he had full authority to decide, meaning that he would not allow the common people in front of him to move their graves here. The pain was so deep that Mrs. Lara could not help but curse. This act of insanity made old Steve's blood boil. He ordered the family to arrest Mrs. Lara and beat her up. Some people felt sorry for Tony and Mrs. Lara's situation and knelt down to beg old Steve for mercy, but were brutally beaten by him with a stick. Everyone had no choice but to turn around and leave. At this time, in the wasteland, only Mrs. Lara was left holding her child's body under the arrogant eyes of old Steve's group. Mrs. Lara knew that this time there was nothing left to lose. The water broke the bank. She screamed like crazy and then laughed out loud like a beast, rushed up to grab old Steve and bit him. Her two hands clutched his face, causing blood to flow out in several lines. Each bite was filled with extreme anger and resentment. She had to kill this vile, corrupt old man. Too mad, he looked around and then picked up a large rock nearby. He held the rock in his hand and walked towards Mrs. Lara, his face full of murderous intent. Just like that, old Steve took the large rock and smashed it straight into Mrs. Lara's head. Each sentence he would scream and then smash it straight into her head over and over again. Mrs. Lara's head was now split open, blood flowing out, her skull shattered, causing the brain inside to scatter outside, looking very horrifying. The smell of blood rushed into the noses of the servants holding her, making them want to vomit. Mrs. Lara was weak. Her resistance was gone. Her face was so deformed that no one recognized her. The hands covering her head also loosened and fell down. Mrs. Lara died in both physical and mental pain. Dropping the rock on the ground, he pulled the hem of his shirt to wipe away the things on his face, spit a mouthful of saliva on Mrs. Lara's crushed head. He contemptuously turned and left, not forgetting to order the family to dig up Mr. Troy's body and throw all three bodies into the cold forest edge. The eldest son stood there witnessing his father's murder. His eyes widened in disbelief that his father would be so brutal. He trembled as he stepped over Tony's corpse and followed old Steve back. No one knew that the three corpses were now showing strange signs, from their eye sockets flowing crimson tears of blood and resentment, as if this family of three was harboring a grudge that the heavens could not fathom. The family stood there, looking at the two corpses with chills. One had died from hanging, the other had his head crushed. Seeing the silhouettes of old Steve and his father gone, the family hurriedly knelt down, continuously praying and begging for forgiveness from the souls of Tony's family, because in the end, they were just lowly beings under old Steve's command. It was getting dark, and the family had left. They all hid the fact that they had buried the three bodies behind the forest, considering it the most conscientious thing to do after the series of tragedies that Steve's family and those involved had caused. It all started that night. Gene took a bucket to catch frogs. It was the rainy season, so frogs were everywhere in the fields. He grabbed until his arms were tired. Gene went further and further until he was absorbed in walking into an empty field near a rice field without realizing it. In a hurry to chase the frog, Gene stepped on a high mound of earth. Suddenly, a cold wind blew from somewhere, making him shiver. He involuntarily looked up and saw a young woman wearing a white outfit, her hair long and disheveled, her head bowed, looking very strange. That female figure was sitting and swinging on a tree branch in front of him. Suddenly, the shadow raised its face and laughed. Its eyes rolled back and forth. Its two veined hands were holding a large frog, slowly bringing it towards Gene to catch the frog. This frog for you," But why did you step on my grave? Why did you step on her grave? She hissed in a voice that echoed as if it came from the underworld, making Jean stand there frozen in fear. Suddenly, her face turned ferocious, her eyes sharpened, her teeth stained with mud and gritted together. She slowly crawled down the tree and approached Jean. Jean was so panicked at this point. He wanted to run away, but the female ghost grabbed his hand and pulled hard, losing his balance, and Jean stumbled and fell to the ground. The female ghost, Jean's eyes were bloodshot. She fiercely stuffed the frog into Jean's mouth, hissing repeatedly. Jean was so scared that he peed his pants. He used all his strength to break free from the ghost's hand and ran away, shouting loudly, "Hey, villagers! There's a ghost! There's a ghost!" Even though his mouth was full of cow dung that night, while Vera and old Steve were sitting and discussing the matter of entertaining the Feng Shui master tomorrow, suddenly a cold wind blew through and slammed the open window shut. Old Steve muttered and cursed. "Damn wind!" Old Steve went to close the window, but in a short moment, through the shadow of his eyes, he saw 3 large shadows flash by. He was startled and rubbed his eyes to look back, but absolutely in front of him was still the pitch-black yard with no movement. He clicked his tongue and was about to turn back when the dog in the corner of the yard howled in waves. He angrily turned back to curse the dog to make it shut up, but what caught his eye was the silhouettes of 3 members of Mrs. Lara's family standing in the middle of the yard. The sharp eyes looked at him with resentment. All 3 were covered in mud. Their bodies were decomposing, skin peeling off in patches, blood everywhere, and they made a loud voice as if coming from the depths of hell, demanding old Steve, "Pay back, pay back, pay back the lives of my whole family. Don't you dare live in peace." The ghosts of Mrs. Lara's whole family laughed madly and disappeared into the quiet night. At the same time, Mrs. Vera saw her husband standing frozen at the window for a long time. She curiously approached and discovered that old Steve's face was pale and bloodless. It was only when she shook him that he screamed in terror. Then he jumped straight onto the bed, covered himself tightly with the blanket, and shivered. This time, he really saw a ghost. The ghosts of Mrs. Lara's whole family came to claim his life. He told Mrs. Vera about it, and the couple couldn't sleep all night. He planned to invite a priest to come back as soon as it was light to protect Lara's house and perform a spell to clear the land at the same time. The next morning, the news that Jean had gone frog hunting and was being hidden by a ghost and then forced to eat cow dung in an empty lot spread throughout this poor village. People began to be afraid. No one dared to go near that empty lot anymore. Only Steve's family, when they went to eat at the market, heard the news, and their faces turned pale. They knew clearly who the woman who had stuffed dung into Jean's mouth last night was. It was definitely Tony's ghost who had appeared. Late afternoon, on the quiet Ricefield Road, 4 figures in neat and tidy clothes came out of the house arrogantly. The first ones were Mrs. Vera and her eldest son, followed by 2 servants. They had been collecting taxes all day and were exhausted. Just then, there was a large tree in front of them, so Mrs. Vera and her son told each other to stop and rest for a while. The 2 had just sat down and were panting like buffaloes when suddenly he saw a young woman not far away. His lust rose, making him forget all his fatigue. He groped his way closer to see what she looked like. The old woman glanced at him and only smirked before turning back to count the money. She understood her beloved son's nature very well. Following a distance behind the dense bushes, both rubbed their hands together, licked their lips, and spoke in a flirtatious tone. The girl still did not turn around, but shyly wiggled her head at his teasing, making him even more delighted and moving closer. And then the moment he grabbed her shoulder and turned her to face him, her appearance made his heart stop. Tony's face when he had hanged himself was magnified in front of him. Not only that, it was also decomposing and crawling with maggots that fell with each shy shake of her head. Tony opened his mouth and laughed crazily. At this moment, both were terrified. Both ran away as fast as they could. While running, they called for their mother to come and save them. When she saw her son screaming in panic, she did not understand what was going on, and when she saw his face was as pale as a banana leaf, she was very worried. Both were panting, unable to catch their breath. He had just seen a ghost. There was no way he could mistake it. He quickly told Mrs. Vera what he had seen and urged her to leave quickly. He didn't want to stay another minute. When they got home, Vera and her mother closed the door and talked for more than 2 hours in their own room. They told their mother everything about the crimes they had committed against Tony. Vera felt uneasy when she heard that. Both the day before and today, Tony's family's spirits had appeared and disturbed her family twice. In no time, the day of the shaman's appointment arrived. Vera and Steve warmly welcomed the shaman, who was superstitious and greedy. Vera paid great attention to spiritual matters like this. After eating and drinking to their heart's content, the old couple sweetly told the shaman what had happened. He nodded as if he understood and conveniently took out some talismans and told them to stick them on the door to prevent the spirits of Lara's family from entering the house. As for him, tonight he would help the couple move the small grave and perform a spell to clear the land. Vera and Steve were overjoyed when they heard this, not knowing that this teacher was just a fake sorcerer, not evil at all. As for him, he was still used to drinking and partying all night long, and tonight was no exception. After eating and drinking to his heart's content, he stood up and left. He was already drunk, so he walked slowly. When he got close to the empty lot, he heard someone crying nearby. Everyone looked around and saw only the empty field, no one but him. After walking a few steps, the crying sound from above rang out again. His whole body was shaking, and he blurted out, "Whoever cries and asks me again, I'll rip your mouth open, and you'll hear." While he was feeling pleased with his scolding, suddenly he saw from afar a figure of a girl with long hair, standing very gracefully and beautifully. That white figure was turning her back to him. Although the incident of being scared by Tony's ghost last time made him lose his appetite for a few days, he put it behind him afterwards, and the alcohol in his body made him horny. He licked his lips and teased as he usually did. The white shadow still stood there silently. When he got closer, the white shadow called out, "Young master, where have you been? I've been waiting here all afternoon." The sweet voice made him happy. He rubbed his hands together, thinking to himself that he had hit the jackpot this time. After saying that, the young girl's shadow took light steps, and he followed the white shadow in a daze. He walked faster and faster, and no matter how fast he walked, he still couldn't reach out and grab it, always being left behind by a distance. He was so absorbed in looking at that beautiful body that he didn't even notice when he reached the old tree in the wasteland. Suddenly, the white shadow stopped. At this moment, everyone thought the opportunity had come. He took off his shirt and threw it hard on the ground, laughing lewdly and rushing forward. At this moment, the girl's head turned back. Her white eyes rolled back, her tongue stuck out and dangled down. Seeing this horrifying scene, everyone fell backwards. At this moment, all the alcohol naturally flew away. The more he looked at that disgusting face, the more sober he became. His heart felt like it was about to fall out. That white shadow was none other than Tony. She smiled wickedly and used her thick, slimy tongue to lick his face a few times. Tay froze, his limbs stiffened. Unable to move, he could only close his eyes and tremble violently. Tony raised his voice shrilly, pointing to the branch of an old tree, asking Car to take his body down. Car unconsciously looked up at the tree, where a young woman's body was hanging by a noose. Car screamed in fear and then crawled up and ran away. Above, the corpse was laughing savagely, and the corpse flew after Car. The faster Car ran, the faster the corpse flew. Then suddenly Tony stood in front of Car, forcing Car to stop abruptly, turning around to run towards the old tree, where Tony's ghost stood there, sticking out its long tongue and wrapping around Car's leg, pulling him down. He peed his pants without realizing it. He kept kowtowing and begging Tony to spare his life. I'm sorry, Tony. Please spare me. I'll burn votive paper for your whole family. Don't haunt me anymore. Don't haunt me anymore. Tony's spirit just curled his lips. It's too late. Pay with your life. At this moment, a noose slowly descended from the old tree. The man just kowtowed and begged, and when he raised his face, the noose was already around his neck. The noose tightened and pulled him up high. The man used his hands to try to pull the noose off his neck, holding on until his 10 fingertips were bleeding. His 2 legs struggled and waved in the air, but it was too late. He was suspended by the noose. The noose slowly tightened, tightening his every breath. The eldest man's eyes were now bulging with lack of energy. His tongue was sticking out. Saliva was dripping and splashing on the ground. Veins were popping out all over his head. The eldest man was weak. Then he let go of his hands and died. The eldest man's face at this moment was no different from Tony's face when he died. Tony's soul stood below, watching the eldest man slowly die, and laughed savagely, signaling that the next murder was about to happen. The next morning, old Steve and Mrs. Vera were still sleeping soundly when they received the news that their son's body was hanging from an old tree branch in the cemetery. The old couple rushed there. The body was cold and stiff. His face was purple with blood, and the blood pouring from his 7 orifices was black and horrifying. Mrs. Vera could not bear it when she saw her son's body and fainted repeatedly. Old Steve, although heartbroken, still silently ordered the servants to take the body down and bring it back for burial. The people around started to gossip. Some people guessed that the death of the son was due to karma. Sooner or later, the whole family of old Steve would have to receive retribution. After the funeral, Steve and his wife were depressed all day and night, unable to sleep for several nights. Every time they closed their eyes, the image of the eldest son being grabbed by the hair and strangled by a female ghost, screaming for help, appeared. Not only that, Steve was also haunted by the ghost of Lara's family. That scared the hell out of him and his wife, living in fear, not daring to sleep, and having to pee close together. Steve and Vera were tormented by Tony's family's ghost for more than a month. Although the couple had to invite the shaman from before to stay at home to exorcise the spirit, it was completely ineffective. Of course, how could a shaman exorcise the spirit? Yet both Vera and Steve clung to him and believed him, pouring all their money into that shaman. Looking at the couple now, they were physically and mentally exhausted, no longer having the arrogant appearance they had before. That night, old Steve woke up from a nightmare. He felt thirsty, so he got out of bed to find a water bottle to drink. With his eyes half closed, he brought the cup of water to his mouth, but immediately had to spit it out. This liquid had a sickening taste in his throat, the strong smell of blood, and a faint stench of a long-dead corpse. He immediately spat out that strange thing, then was shocked to see that the liquid was dark red, full of maggots. Not yet over his horror, he immediately felt a cold chill running down his spine, a skinny hand placed on his shoulder. At this moment, he just wanted to run away, but he couldn't. Old Steve's whole body felt like it was tied up by an invisible rope. He slowly turned around. It was Mrs. Lara, Mr. Troy, and Tony standing there without him knowing, or more accurately, the ghosts of the 3 of them had come to take his life. Their mouths were wide open to the ears, their red tongues constantly wriggling in front of Steve. Mrs. Lara and Mr. Troy laughed coldly, making Steve even more frightened. "You dug up my grave. You killed me. You killed my whole family. Then you have to pay. You have to pay." He kept shouting for his wife to save him, but Mrs. Vera was completely oblivious, still lying motionless on the bed. Steve crawled on the floor. Everywhere he looked, he saw the scene of Troy's body being dug up and lying on the ground, just like the scene when he ordered people to dig up Troy's grave. The decomposed body was smiling at him. The red, foul-smelling liquid with wriggling maggots flowing out made him nauseous. The liquid he had just drunk, and this one probably came from the same source. Mrs. Lara's spirit then came forward and grabbed Steve's head, dragged him to the edge of the table, and slammed his head down, causing blood to flow profusely. The more he begged, the faster Mrs. Lara pounded. Everything happened exactly like the scene that day when he used a rock to smash Mrs. Lara's head, except that today the roles were reversed. The victim was him, and he had to pay with blood for the crime he had committed. After repeated hits on the edge of the table, Steve's head was also crushed. He was weak and then died, his eyes wide open, his face covered in blood and brain matter all over the table corner and the floor. Mrs. Lara and Tony looked at Vera lying on the bed with a devilish smile and then disappeared. The next morning, the whole village heard Vera's wailing. Old Steve died in a very gruesome manner. She had just lost her son and now her husband, karma and retribution. The people around took turns throwing rocks and dirt at her house, cursing her family for being cruel, that she was a poisonous snake, that her whole family deserved it. Karma will not wait for anyone. Old Vera lost all support and lived a miserable life. Every afternoon, she saw the silhouettes of Tony's 3 ghosts standing there in her yard, looking at her with sorrowful eyes. At her feet were old Steve and the eldest, kneeling with their heads down, one with his hair grabbed, the other with a chain around his neck. Tony's ghost mumbled something in his mouth that only Vera could hear, causing her to scream in horror. Over the past few years, Vera had gone crazy and wandered everywhere, eating dirty things and sleeping on the ground, and every night was still haunted by Tony's ghosts, living a half-dead life every day. Her family's property was partly stolen by the deceitful shaman and partly destroyed by the people. People still say that every night during the ghost month, in that house, the shadow of old Steve appears, and the old tree in the wasteland appears, with a human figure hanging from it. Today's story ends here. Thank you for listening to all of you. I don't know what you think about this story. Please leave your comments. Now goodbye and see you again. I wish you a good night's sleep. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to support David and the entire team of our channel.